Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gistina. Joining us this week, pollster Steve Greenberg. He's back with another poll to tell us all about it from the well-known Siena poll, which emanates from the Siena College Research Institute. You can read all about it at scri.siena.edu. We welcome back Steve Greenberg to the Capital Connection. Hey, Steve.
Great to be with you, Dave.
Good to be with you as well. Now, what we've seen in some of your polls in the past when it comes to New York Governor Kathy Hochul is that she had been going in the downward direction. Now she's up a little bit, but sort of treading water in this area.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. What I've been saying is that this is a good news, bad news poll for Governor Hochul. The good news is that for the second consecutive poll, both her favorability rating and her job approval rating are both up a little bit from their all-time lows in September. They came up a few points in October, now up a few points here in December. So where she stands, right now 39% of voters view Kathy Hochul favorably, 49% view her unfavorably. Again, back in September, it was 34-54, so underwater by 20 points. Now 39-49, underwater by only 10 points. Job approval rating, even better, getting close to break even. So right now, 46% of voters approve of the job that Hochul is doing as governor, but 49% disapprove. Up from from October when it was 41 approved, 51 disapprove. So a little bit of a bounce back. That's the good news. The bad news is both ratings remain underwater. Her favorability rating has not been positive. We'd have to go back almost a year to the first month of this year in January when she had a 45-42% favorable rating, so on the positive side. But that's the last time. And I think we often talk about a poll as nothing more than a snapshot in time, and that's true. So that's where Hochul stands with voters right now in December 2024. But we can look back over the nearly 3.5 years that Hochul has been governor. And to me, what is amazing is that in a state where 49% of the enrolled voters are Democrats, never once in 3.5 years has Kathy Hochul had a favorability rating that hit 50%. 49 is the highest she has ever gotten on her favorability rating. And after 3.5 years as governor, she's got her work cut out for her because New Yorkers feel like they know her, but they're not happy with the job that she's doing at the moment.
We're speaking with pollster Steve Greenberg of the Siena poll. Now, Steve, I would venture a guess that much like the rest of the politicians in the country, including the still incumbent President Joe Biden, have suffered in the polls largely because of inflation. People's feeling that their pocketbooks and wallets are being hit hard on the essentials like groceries and fuel. Now, a lot of this has come back down to some level, but I can only imagine that has not escaped voters' thinking when it comes to the governor of New York.
Absolutely not. Look, the top issue that voters want the governor, the legislature to address in Albany when they come back to session next month is the cost of living in New York. 43% of New Yorkers say it is the single top issue that they want Albany to address this year. When we ask voters their second choice, if we put them together, so 43% of voters say it's their absolute top choice, 71% of voters, more than two-thirds, not quite three-quarters of voters, say it's one of their top two issues that they want Albany to address. And when we ask voters, over the last year, has the cost of living gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse? only 6% of voters said it's gotten better. Only 17% said it stayed the same. A whopping 76%, three-quarters of New Yorkers say the cost of living in the state has gotten worse over the last year. So it's the top issue they want they want Albany to address. It's an issue that they feel has continued to get worse over the last year, and the governor is paying the price for that.
Yeah, and I wonder, you must be itching to find this out. The governor has a new plan that's just come out to give $300 back to New Yorkers as sort of inflation refund, because she is recognizing that New Yorkers are upset, just what you said, with the high cost of living. So I wonder what your next poll will find in regard to this idea of giving folks refunds.
Well, we'll certainly, we're going to wait for the governor's state of the state. She's moved the date, so it'll be the second week in January rather than the first week in January. And then in the third week in January, she'll come out with her executive budget proposal. So after the state of the state and the budget come out, we will certainly go in and look at a whole number of different specifics that she's proposing to see if New Yorkers like them or don't like them. Hard to imagine New Yorkers not liking the idea of a tax rebate. $300 up to $300 for an individual who makes, I think, $150,000, and $500 for a family making less than $300,000. It'll be interesting to see how voters feel about that and various other proposals she comes forward with now. As we know, this week she went to a supermarket here in the
right.
Albany area and went shopping with a consumer to see about prices of groceries. So it'll be interesting to see how the governor plays this out, what she lays out as her agenda, how successful she is in communicating that to the voters, because the old cliche, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, it doesn't make a noise. The governor has yet to really connect with the voters of this state. And even when she put congestion pricing on pause back in June and voters supported it, they didn't give her credit. But now that she's putting it back in place for January down in Manhattan, I would imagine, and we will certainly ask early next year to see, do the voters hold her responsible for that increased tax, if you will?
Yeah, I would believe that they will. They've certainly not been happy about it, and it's been one of those issues that have crossed party lines. Even some Democrats have criticized the governor for what they call a tax on New Yorkers. And, for those that are supportive of the congestion pricing plan, people like Senator Liz Kruger will say you can take public transportation below 60th Street. You don't have to take a vehicle. That's the whole point of the legislation. So it will be interesting to see. New Yorkers don't like to pay any kind of fees or taxes.
No, and we asked voters specifically about this new $9 congestion pricing toll plan that the governor is implementing in January. Only 29% of New Yorkers support it. 51%, a clear majority, oppose it. Not surprisingly, 66% of Republicans oppose it. 56% of independent voters oppose it. But even Democrats are closely divided. 40% of Democrats support the congestion pricing toll plan, but a slight plurality, 42% of Democrats oppose it. So it's not popular with any particular group of voters in this state.
Well, let's go to another area that is an issue that is impacting, again, not only New York, but the country, many areas in this country, and that's affordable housing. You have some numbers on that.
Yeah, again, we asked voters their top issue they want Albany to address, and their second top issue. Number 2 on that list is housing. 19% of New Yorkers said that the availability of affordable housing is their top priority for Albany to address. But 48% of voters, nearly half, say it's one of their top 2 priorities. So both of the top priorities voters are looking for Albany to address are economic related, the cost of living generally, but then the availability of affordable housing, be it rental or for purchase. And when we ask voters over the last year, has the availability of affordable housing gotten better in New York, stayed about the same, or gotten worse? Only 5% say it's gotten better. 21% say it's stayed about the same, but more than two-thirds, 68% of voters say the availability of affordable housing in the state continued to get worse last year.
Let's go to another area. And you often hear this used in elections. It rears its head almost in every election we find. Crime is too high. We've got to stop the crime. And, despite national statistics, and there are exceptions in certain areas, obviously, but despite those statistics that show crime going down fairly steadily, New Yorkers are concerned about crime in the state. And it's no surprise that if you're hearing in the news, the criteria often involves shootings and crime, you might think there's a lot of crime.
Absolutely. Look, voters vote based on their perceptions, not based on the statistics that criminologists put out there. Because you're right, crime statistics show that crime has been going down. Voters don't feel that. Over the last year, 54% of New Yorkers, a clear majority, say that crime in the state has gotten worse. When we ask about closer to home, has crime in your community gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse? Almost the same number. 53% of New Yorkers say that crime in their community has gotten worse over the last year. And when we ask voters, are you concerned that you might be a victim of crime? 58% of voters say they are very or somewhat concerned that they could be a victim of crime. So, yeah, crime statistics may be coming down, but voters' perception of crime across the state, in their community, that it could hit them, continues to be a real problem.
Yeah, it dawns on me, Steve Greenberg, that, we see more homelessness these days, people out on the street, and the perception, it's hard not to have a perception that when someone is out on the street that they might be potentially doing something wrong. And you wonder how much more homelessness might feed into that perception of more crime. But one of the other issues that has impacted New York is migrants and immigration. And you've got some numbers on that as well.
Yeah, we as voters, has the recent influx of migrants to New York, has that situation gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse over the last year? A very similar number, 54% of New Yorkers say it's gotten worse. 34%, a little more than a third, say it's stayed about the same. Only 8% have said it's gotten better. But in terms of the top issues New Yorkers want Albany to address, we talked about cost of living. 71% say it's a top two issue. Affordable housing, 48% say it's a top two issue. Crime, 38% say it's a top two issue. And migrants, 35%. So only a little more than a third say that that's a top issue. But we also asked voters, in light of what then candidate Trump and now President-elect Trump has been saying about deportations, we asked voters, if the Trump administration tries to deport immigrants who are in New York illegally, should the state support the federal government's efforts, or should the state oppose the federal government's efforts? And by a 54 to 35% margin, New Yorkers say New York State should support what the federal government is doing if they're trying to deport migrants in New York who are here illegally. 87% of Republicans say the state should support. Independents say the state should support by a 54 to 30% margin. Democrats oppose by a 51 to 38% margin. They say the state should oppose the federal government's efforts, but still a sizable portion of Democrats, 38%, say the state should support it.
Very interesting numbers from the latest Siena poll. We're listening to Steve Greenberg. And another area that sparked my interest, because just this week we're seeing a coalition of groups, people at the state capitol. They want the governor to move forward on a lot of environmental legislation, including making polluters pay for their pollution. And of course, the state of New York passed an Environmental Bond Act not that long ago now, and they're trying to up the renewables from the New York Power Authority, which has been going around the state and held hearings to that end. And many, even the scientists who suggest that we have to get off fossil fuels, say a lot of the renewables can't do it all. And so enter nuclear power. There's been a lot of talk lately, sort of under the radar for many, that nuclear power is going to have to come back in the mix if we're going to tackle this climate change issue. And you actually asked New Yorkers about nuclear power.
We did. We asked whether they would support or oppose the building of new nuclear power plants in New York, and New Yorkers are virtually evenly divided. 42% of New Yorkers support building new nuclear power plants, 43% oppose. But here's an interesting factoid, Dave, and it's something I don't recall seeing before. Not surprisingly, there is a partisan divide here. So Republicans support it by a 55 to 31% margin, or by 24 points. Democrats oppose it by 16 points, 35 to 51. Put those together, there's a 40-point net difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. However, even wider is the gender gap on this issue. Men support new nuclear power plants 2-1, 59 to 29%, or by 30 points. Women oppose it nearly 2-1, or by 27 points. They oppose it 56 to 29%. So the partisan net difference is 57 points, far wider than the 40-point partisan divide. I'm sorry, the gender divide, 57 points, far wider than the 40-point partisan divide. And that's something I don't recall ever seeing on an issue like this before.
What do you make of it yourself?
I don't know. I mean, clearly men are comfortable with the notion of nuclear power plants, and women in New York are clearly uncomfortable.
We're speaking with pollster Steve Greenberg of the Siena poll. So all the information we've gotten so far on Governor Hochul, with her numbers being where they are, what are the chances that New Yorkers are going to be in the mood to reelect her?
Well, I would say that luckily for Governor Hochul, the Democratic primary is a year and a half away, and the general election is nearly 2 years away. Because right now, when we ask New Yorkers, if the election were today, would you be inclined to reelect Governor Hochul, or would you prefer, quote, someone else, unquote? Only 33% of New Yorkers say they're prepared to reelect the governor. 57%, a clear majority, a strong majority, say they would prefer someone else. And even if you just look at how her fellow Democrats feel on this question, 48% of Democrats, not quite a majority, say they're prepared to reelect Hochul. 40% of Democrats say they would prefer someone else.
Very interesting. I wonder if she'll end up getting primaried. Well, let's talk about the lieutenant governor, Antonio Delgado.
Not very well known, not surprising. Governor Hochul wasn't well known when she was lieutenant governor. But right now, 17% of New Yorkers view Delgado favorably. 15% view him unfavorably. But more than two-thirds of voters, 68%, have either never heard of Antonio Delgado or don't know enough about him to have an opinion. And those numbers are pretty comparable to, say, Congressman Richie Torres from the Bronx, who's making noises about potentially running for governor, or Democrat, or Congressman Mike Lawler from the Hudson Valley, a Republican, who's talking about running for governor. Torres, 19% of New Yorkers view him favorably, 13% view him unfavorably, but that same 68% either never heard of him or don't know enough about him to have an opinion. And for Mike Lawler, 17% of New Yorkers view him favorably right now, 20% unfavorably, 64%, slightly lower, but nearly two-thirds of voters have either never heard of him or don't know enough about him to have an opinion. And I would say for all three of them, if they're considering running for governor, the fact that they're unknown to two-thirds of the voters presents them with an opportunity. They have a year and a half till primary day, nearly 2 years to election day. They have an opportunity to define themselves before they get defined in a negative way.
No question about it. Interesting numbers there. Well, now let's go to something I think is even more interesting and impactful to New York, and that's how voters think when it comes to whether the Trump administration will fund major New York infrastructure projects.
Yeah, New Yorkers are divided on whether they think the Trump administration will fund New York infrastructure projects. And we said, for example, like Moynihan Station in New York City and upstate highway construction, which we know is going on in big ways in Syracuse and Buffalo right now. Only 44% of New Yorkers think it is likely, very likely, or somewhat likely that the Trump administration will fund those projects in New York. A slight plurality, 48%, think it is either very or totally unlikely that they will do so. Not surprising, a big partisan divide. 79% of Republicans think the Trump administration will deliver. 66% of Democrats think the Trump administration won't deliver. Independents closely divided, but leaning on the Republican side. So by a 46 to 42% margin, independents think that the Trump administration will deliver. There's not a huge regional difference other than New York City by a 57 to 31% margin thinks that the administration won't come through. Not surprising given the partisan makeup of New York City. But the downstate suburbs and upstate, both very closely divided on whether they think the Trump administration will deliver or not.
Yeah, and I think we have to add in that the former now president-elect Donald Trump has made revenge a key part of what he says he's going to do in office. And we do know there is a criminal case pending against him in New York. So we'll see what kind of treatment New York is in from the Trump administration going forward.
On the other hand, I mean, it is the city where the man grew up.
That's right.
The vast majority of his adult life. It is where his signature building, Trump Tower, is located. So we'll see how he feels about his former home state.
Yeah, we certainly will. Well, let's talk about some other prominent New Yorkers and how citizens feel about them being picked for prominent positions. That's former Representative Lee Zeldin, Trump picked for the EPA, and of course, Representative Elise Stefanik, Trump's appointment to be U.S. Ambassador to the UN.
Yeah, it's the first time we've ever asked about Stefanik in a statewide Siena poll. Right now, 22% of New Yorkers say they view Stefanik favorably, 29% view her unfavorably, and about half of New Yorkers, 49%, say they've either never heard of her or don't know enough about her to have an opinion.
Never heard of her.
You know, crazy people like me pay attention to this
and me
stuff, politics and government, and you. I didn't want to call you crazy all the time, but the average New Yorker doesn't. Think about this example. Tom DiNapoli has been the state controller for almost 18 years now. He's won 4 statewide elections. In 3 of those elections, he got more votes than anybody else on the ballot in New York. We didn't have Tom in this current poll, but we've had him in polls for favorability ratings in the last few months. And what we find every time is more than half of New Yorkers either have never heard of Tom DiNapoli or don't know enough about him to have an opinion. It's the person who's gotten the most votes in this state in 3 elections.
It's really sad.
He's on radio. He's in the newspaper a lot with audits, with all kinds of issues that the state controller is involved in, and New Yorkers don't know him.
It's so sad. And he has a prominent role, and he should have an even more prominent role in investigating pre-audits and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. But, you know, New Yorkers don't pay, unfortunately, a lot of attention. When we look at Lee Zeldin, I'll give you another example.
Yeah.
When we talk about Lee Zeldin, right now, 28% of New Yorkers say they view Zeldin favorably. 31% view him unfavorably. 41% say they've either never heard of him or don't know enough about him to have an opinion. He came within 6 percentage points of beating Kathy Hochul to become governor of New York just 2 years ago. If we look back 2 years ago, December 2022, a month after he had lost that election narrowly, 46% of New Yorkers viewed him favorably, 32% unfavorably, and only 22% didn't know enough about him to have an opinion. That has doubled, nearly doubled. It went from 22% in December 2022 to now 41% in December 2024. That's how short voters' memories are.
They have short memories. They don't pay attention. They don't know who anybody is. And then they're mad at the government when the decisions that get made don't agree with what they think.
That is true. I mean, think about what just went on in the last presidential election.
I don't want
last month. The focus was on 7 states, 7 swing states that were going to be decided, and it turns out they were decided very narrowly. Trump won all 7, but they were decided very narrowly. It is a few 100,000 people combined in those 7 states who determined the outcome of this election. And it happens to be the same people who pay the least attention to politics and government. And they're the folks who chose the president.
He is Steve Greenberg, pollster for the Siena College Research Institute, the well-known Siena poll. Hey, Steve, when's your next New York Times collaboration?
Don't know. We're certainly talking to them. There's some interesting city elections taking place in New York City in 2025, so we will see where we go. The next statewide poll will be, sometime in probably late January after the governor unveils her State of the State address and puts forward her executive budget for the coming year.
Well, those of you that listen to this show, I know, pay attention. So tune into that address on January 14th. I'm sure we will have it live here on public radio across the state. He is Steve Greenberg from the Siena poll. I can't thank you enough for coming on again and again and again when these polls come out to give New Yorkers a sense of what we're all thinking. And increasingly, it's less and less of us. Thank you, Steve, for joining us on the Capital Connection.
Always a pleasure, Dave. Thank you, and happy holidays to you and all the listeners.
And to you. Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For the Capital Connection, I'm David Guistina.